Hello, everybody. My name is Ken Coates. I'm a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Delighted to have you with us today. We're looking at this question of First Nations and the energy to succeed, at a very provocative and sort of controversial topic about the way in which Indigenous communities have been engaged in the oil and gas industry and pipeline development and pipeline construction and management operations. This, of course, is a political issue in Canada over the last little while, but often one that's not very well understood. So we're very fortunate to have two wonderful, very experienced individuals today who are going to help us explore this issue in considerable detail. So I'm joined today by Chris Sankey. Chris is a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's a business person, owner and president of Blackfish Enterprises. He provides strategic advice to Indigenous communities, to corporations involved in the sector, been speaking internationally, talking about sort of the opportunities that are here in the area. He's got tons of experience as an elected councillor for his own Lac community near Prince Rupert, and has superb experience in a whole variety of areas relating to oil and gas development. Chris, it's terrific having you with us today. We're joined also by Crystal Smith. Crystal Smith is the chief counselor for the Haisla National Council. She is, in my opinion, one of the most impressive Indigenous leaders in this country, both in terms of her commitment to her community and the work that she's done at a community level, but also her very creative engagement with corporations, with the economy more generally. She's been the chief counselor, which is the equivalent of the chief for her community since 2017. She has a bachelor's degree from Coast Mountain College. She has been very heavily involved in the First Nations LNG Alliance, which has been working on partnerships with the energy sector, with government and other agencies, and is one of the most outspoken advocates for properly done economic involvement, not sort of not responding immediately to the interests of what the mining companies might want done, or what the oil and gas companies might want done, but what the interests of the First Nations happen to be in these really important issues. So what we're going to do, folks, today is we're going to have an opening statement by each of by Chris and Crystal. I'm then going to ask a series of questions. I've received about 25 questions from people who are in the audience already, and I'll intersperse those as we sort of go along. We promised everybody that we'll finish on the hour, so this is a 1 hour long webinar. Toward the very end, we'll give Crystal and Chris a chance to sort of make a final concluding comment, and we'll wrap up exactly on the half hour. So we're going to turn to Chris first. Chris is actually in Prince Rupert and experiencing some of the internet challenges we often face in northern Canada. But Chris, I'm going to turn to you first, so you can give us your opening thoughts about this issue of First Nations and the energy sector.
Well, thanks, Ken. I appreciate being on the panel with Chief Crystal Smith at Haisla. I'm calling in from the Coast Sipshean territory of Loch Wolams and Metlakatla, and I'm pleased to be here. Look, the only way forward now is clearly Indigenous-led energy initiatives. Haisla is a prime example of what could be done when a community comes together and works for a common goal. I've always said that in order for resource projects to come to fruition, in particular when I think of the Coast Sipshean territory, in terms of what Haisla has been able to accomplish, when the communities are aligned, talking about the Sipshean communities, relationship with the Nisga'a, the Haida, all the way through to the Wet'suwet'en, and through that economic corridor, which you are essentially telling industries that you're de-risking the project proposal. And that's important for the investment community, both here in Canada and the international community when they're looking to invest. So when we are aligned, when our communities are aligned, when it's a nation-to-nation dialogue, you have now essentially opened the runway for industry to come to the table in a meaningful way, to develop a meaningful relationship that is going to set the tone for not only project development, but to build our communities for the next 7 generations. It's about intergenerational knowledge and wealth transfer for the next 7 generations.
Thanks, Chris. Wonderful, eloquent statement, one that you've been encouraging communities to consider for quite some time. So, Crystal, I'll leave it to you to sort of describe what you've actually been doing with Haisla and LNG and pipeline development generally. But I'd love your opening statement, please.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And it definitely is an honor to be on having this conversation with you, Ken, and with you as well, Chris. I'm calling in today from our traditional territory of the Haisla Nation, and our experience essentially with the oil and gas sector and everything that Chris had spoken to. We've been able to relatively successfully accomplish here in our territory with LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink announcing their positive final investment decision in 2018. Prior to that, we had been working very diligently in terms of not only the planning, but planning the build and construction of LNG Canada. Our nation has been a part of these conversations leading up to the success and the positive final investment decision by means of participating in conversations that led to the successful awarding of permits that had to do with some major components of the project, and we took a different approach by being a part of the conversations at every level. We developed an approach where our nation would be reviewing the topics at length, having our cultural values incorporated into a lot of the applications even before they went to any regulatory body, thus having a letter signed of support as a part of the application process. And I truly believe that incorporation of our input into the process is what led to the success of LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink. Aside from those conversations and engagements, we were successful in obtaining 400 MMCF of capacity off of the Coastal GasLink project, which is the largest accommodation that our nation was awarded for the support for these projects, to which we are currently working towards a positive final investment decision for our majority-owned Cedar LNG project, which we're in partnership with Pembina Pipelines at the time. So there's my opening comments.
Well, those are great opening comments, and I think a lot of people will be surprised by sort of some of the observations that you've made, and I think at times the perception in the country as a whole. So, Chris, I'm going to turn this question to you. The perception in the country as a whole is that Indigenous people sort of protest against oil and gas development, protest against pipeline development, or not in favor of these activities going forward. So, Chris, speaking more generally, what is your experience with Indigenous communities? Are they completely opposed to oil and gas and pipeline development? Have they found the right way to accommodate, or is the Haisla First Nation an exception, or is it closer to the norm? What are your thoughts on that? Oh, and we're having trouble with Chris's connection, I'm afraid. So actually, Crystal.
Hello. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
There you go. Sorry about that, folks. Bad internet connection. Look, the vast majority of Indigenous communities are in favor of responsible resource development. And it's important to note that if we're going to go forward as a nation, I don't think it is right that outside influence should come into the factor of trying to grow our communities, because it's not just about the project, it's about building capacity within our communities. I think long gone are the days where a proponent would come in and want to just talk about the project because it was engineered and it suits it's built to suit the market. those days are gone. So now what's happening with industry is they're actually coming in and they're asking what the community needs are. Like a service needs determination. What sort of capacity do we have existing at this very moment? And then what does it look like going forward for the next few decades? Yeah. Like I said, the next 7 generations. But the vast majority of the Haisla project working up there. And that's a testament to Haisla opening the door to other nations in the region, in the territory, not just in the region, but throughout the province and throughout the country. So I think it clearly shows that from here, from Tidewater on.
Oh, thanks, Chris. You're still having some problems with your internet, so you're sort of coming in and out, but I certainly got the main thrust of what you were saying is that, you know, the majority of Indigenous communities are in favor of properly done development. I think that's a really important caveat. It is not any development, anytime, any place. And that they're looking for this to build their communities in a different sort of way. So Kristen, if I can go back to you, when you, in your community, and I know you said about the investment decision coming in 2018, and of course the whole work went on a decade or longer before then. Your community spent an enormous amount of time deciding whether they wanted to be involved. And again, you're not just the end of the term. You're not just the terminus of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. You actually have an LNG plant right in the community, and you also have the the Cedar, the Cedar plant, which is actually also going to be developed right in your community. So why? Please explain to us why the Haisla have so carefully and thoughtfully engaged in the LNG development and pipeline development.
I think Chris made a huge comment. When he was making a comment, actually, I was thinking about the engagement piece that are so vital to the success of these projects is our own community engagement sessions and our processes. Our community hasn't LNG hasn't only come to our community within the last 5-6 years. We've been dealing with the LNG industry for well over a decade. We actually had a terminal that was proposed for one of our reserves that was supposed to be an import facility, but then eventually got proposed for an export facility, which was the Kitimat LNG project. So in regards to our work that we've been doing over the last decade has heavily involved education, information sessions, open, hard dialogue with our community members, not only within our reserve boundaries, but we took that engagement session and got our entire membership involved in the process, so that we were certain that we had, as the leaders of our community, that we had the mandate, had the approval moving forward with our entire membership in mind, that they supported the industry. The one aspect I truly believe that allowed this process to move forward was the hope and the desire of having careers and the opportunity here at home. Our territory hasn't been. We've had industry development in our territory for many years because of the access to the port that we're fortunate to have. Our nation hasn't always been a part of the conversations that allowed the build and construction of those industries, and have essentially been on the other side of the Douglas Channel, watching a community in our territory prosper while we sat on the sidelines and had very limited resources or opportunity for our people. So when LNG first came to our territory, we talked heavily on the opportunities that would be provided, not only within careers, but the supports that would come along for us to be able to provide educational opportunities and training opportunities for our people. And it didn't all relate to the LNG industry. We heavily spoke about other opportunities. If you wanted, what the industry is going to bring to our communities are other spin-off jobs. You know, we're going to need more teachers. We need more nurses. And any career decision that our membership would love to have and love to bring home and provide those their skill set to our region is heavily encouraged. So I think the key piece that we definitely focused on was having our membership a part of the process with us in every step.
So, Crystal, this is wonderful. And a couple of things I wanted to highlight for everybody's benefit. In most communities now, 50 to 60% of community First Nation members don't live on reserve anymore. And I know in the case of the Haisla, you've got lots of people living in Terrace, which is close by, a little bit further away in Prince Rupert, but down south in Vancouver and over in Prince George, the people are quite widely dispersed, right? And it's kind of an interesting thing that in the last 20 years, the politics of a First Nation community very much rests on getting everybody on board. This is not just about the people living in one place. And I don't know what your experience has been, so I'll ask you this really quickly, that oftentimes the people who have left because they couldn't find jobs. And so they're enthusiastic about these kinds of things because they hope to be able to come home. Is that a fair observation?
It is definitely a fair observation. We've seen quite a few members that you know, the issue that we're having now, and you know, there's new problems for us to tackle. Another one is housing, that we need to be able to provide housing, adequate housing, in order to move our members home. So we've seen a few members that have been reaching out, asking what opportunities. What we're focusing on is, again, those long-term careers, so that they can definitely move home and raise their families here.
Yeah, and I just, that's great. And I always think sometimes, because I've been to Kitimat many times over the years, I kind of assume that everybody knows the area we're talking about. But Kitimat is one of the most beautiful locations in the world. It's sitting at the head of this wonderful channel, a deep water port that is actually of world-class sort of capabilities. But you also are the home to Alcan, Rio Tinto now, actually, with one of the largest aluminum smelters in North America. We have the Camano project, which is basically took power from the upper reaches of the Fraser River and brings it over into the Kitimat region, and a long history of industrial development. And as you pointed out, industrial development that did not include very many Indigenous people. In fact, I remember the first couple of times I visited Kitimat, there was Kitimat and there was the reserve. And these things could not have been further apart. Even though they weren't geographically very far apart, they were culturally, economically, socially very, very distant. And the last couple of times I've been there, boy, oh boy, has it ever changed. You know, they have a lot of engagement. Wouldn't say integration so much, because the reserve community is still a reserve community, but in a good way, as opposed to a sort of a marginalized kind of way. So those of you who haven't been to Kitimat, go to Kitimat. It's a great and interesting place. And so, Chris, to go, and I hope your internet keeps working better. It's not your fault. One of the things that Indigenous communities have dealt with has been the involvement of environmental organizations from outside the region. And I just want to give you, and maybe Chris, you might want to jump in on this after Chris has spoken as well. These Indigenous environmental organizations are honorable people who have their own view of the world. And what is that relationship like with Indigenous communities that are trying to sort of make some sort of an accommodation with the oil and gas and pipeline industry? It's been a source of considerable tension. So, Chris, your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, they've been historically speaking, it has been very friendly with the interference from non-government organizations that have these agendas to stop all projects. But I think in the last year or so, I've noticed a shift happening where there are more hereditary and elected bodies coming to the table, and maybe that was the the argument all along why they kept interfering, that they wanted to make sure that the hereditary voice was being heard. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. In our community, we're already doing that. In fact, we've never had an issue with electing those who hold high-ranking hereditary names. I hold a house name. The current mayor holds a high-ranking name. There's so many of us that are well adversed in our culture and many in our language and arts. So that's never been an issue, but the NGOs, for the most part, unfortunately, have stifled development within our communities. I mean, we take a look back at both TC Energy, the pipeline, and looking at TMX, there were so many foreign interference in the development and the prosperity of our communities that what it actually ended up happening was that we had community members fighting community members, and it was wrong. And I really believe that a lot of those relationships are going to take a long time to heal. Clearly in the Wet'suwet'en territory, from what we saw, or what the world saw, it was really unfortunate. And I could only always wish that nation a prosperous future. But I can say that the leaders that I'm currently working with have been more engaged with our neighboring communities. And I think we're seeing a change happen. And I think the only way forward now is to make sure that our communities are sharing resources, that our communities are the same voice. And we're not always going to agree on things, and that's okay, as long as we continue to advance prosperity for our people without NGO interference. I think the next 7 generations are going to be in good hands.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, very much. Chris, do you want to weigh in on that topic as well? The role of external organizations and environmental groups?
I've had my share, and our community has had our share. I mean, at certain points, that relationship has been very meaningful in regards to some of our focuses around other industrial activity that has happened in our territory. However, nothing changes within our communities when we're constantly being steered in a different focus and not being able to essentially open up that conversation from all aspects of taking consideration and making those decisions and having informed decisions being made. We've had the NGOs and other different entities in our community, but when they left, our community was still left in poverty. Our community was still left without opportunity for jobs or an advancement in any type. I've had my share of experiences in 2019 with the Coastal GasLink pipeline, where I felt so strongly, our nation felt so strongly in regards to the success that we're experiencing today that would come from Coastal GasLink and LNG Canada. And it was definitely quite an enlightening experience for myself personally, seeing as the backlash that not only myself received personally, but our entire community had received. Everything from messages on every level of social media coming at me for making the decisions that our community has made. But what I found interesting through that process was it wasn't it was our own Indigenous people that were making those comments to me, not any outside entities making comments. So we were often being called sellouts, but I truly believe that we've invested in our people. And I think today, if you had come to our community even 6 years ago, you come into our community today, and it's absolutely transforming. We're able to provide programs and services that meet the needs of our people. And I'd stated on a panel a couple of weeks ago in Toronto that everything that we've been through throughout this process, I would not change. And I'm so fortunate to have been able to sit at the table, to be able to see this transformation happen in our community.
It's so interesting, Crystal. You and I have talked about this before, and I think one of the things I find really fascinating is that two things, I guess. One is that a lot of the money that's coming into the community is being invested in language and culture, and you're using this to strengthen those very important parts of your society and give the First Nation a chance to sort of flourish, as you described. The other one, I think Canadians generally don't sort of understand the degree to which Indigenous communities are sick and tired of being poor, and sick and tired of the only other Canadian offer on the table. And the other Canadian offer on the table is welfare dependency. So you either involved in the economy or you're not involved. And if you're not involved, then you're going to have social assistance. And social assistance comes with crushing obligations and crushing impacts on the communities as a whole, which is just fascinating. And I hope, you're such a gentle person. But I've read those social media attacks that First Nations people and leaders have to endure. They are vicious beyond belief at times. And sometimes they come from inside the community. These are hard debates, but they often come from outside the community as well. And people they're described as being, you're not Aboriginal enough because you're not opposing the pipeline, which I think is just absurd for a non-Aboriginal person to say something like that to you. So, good on you for sort of persisting. Chris, I'm going to ask you sort of a somewhat more general question. And this is a question from one of our audience members. Lawrence asked this question of, what is the most significant impediment to economic reconciliation for Indigenous peoples? Here we have a case where Crystal and the Haisla are moving ahead very quickly. Other communities in northern British Columbia not so successfully. Lots of resistance and things like that. So, Chris, what's actually standing in the way of economic reconciliation in Canada?
Well, that's a good question. It's actually policy development from the government around the EA process and permitting, the time to receive permitting, as well as some overlapping territories with regards to neighboring nations. One of the things we are trying to stay away from now is making sure that we keep it to a commercial deal. There are going to be some opportunities coming up here in the very near future where the nations want to just look at fee simple lands where it's a strict commercial deal. I think the important thing that as Indigenous people, we need to demonstrate that we are aligned so that industry and investment could come to the table in a welcoming manner. But if we don't, then we're going to, for us in particular, the Coast Tsimshian and other Tsimshian communities and neighboring communities, if we continue to go down this path where we are putting up our own barriers, then we're going to watch the ship sail by somewhere else. I think the nations and communities understand now that what we lost, like it's been 10 years since Petronas engaged. It would have been our first year shipping LNG, and just unfortunately, it was the site that the general population, including our own people, had a problem with. It wasn't so much a project. So, but that being said, I think that industry and the community themselves are doing a better job of engaging with our people, so they're kept abreast. But to put it bluntly, I think the government needs to move out of the way and let the nations build that relationship with one another, to develop policy together, to take resources from one another. And when I talk policy, I'm talking about implementing our own culture, our own knowledge with innovation and technology, along with industry. And you put that all in one room, what better way to take care of the environment and grow the economy? So it's, again, I go back, it's policy development is an impediment in British Columbia. There are just so many hurdles to jump over. Just when you think you're done one part of the process, they add 2 or 3 or 4 more. And the other thing to this is that is really hurting British Columbia and particular Canada, but British Columbia, because it's the gateway to Southeast Asia, is that when we have the environmental assessment review, somebody from Oregon or Washington or some godforsaken place on the planet could submit an objection to the project, and that is wrong. I mean, how are we allowing international input into an economic opportunity that's going to bring prosperity to our people. I mean, they don't live here. They don't live here. And we who better to understand the environment than the very people who live here. And it's really frustrating for us to watch so many people run to the news, in particular, a lot of urban organizations run to the news and profess that they're speaking for all communities because they were able to get in touch with a select few from our nations. That's wrong. There's a thing called democracy. We're not always going to see eye to eye. We're not always going to agree. But the reality is that we need to be at the table when negotiating these multi-billion-dollar initiatives, because these are going to be multi-generational transformation. So when my kids become my age, you're going to see a whole different Canada. And it's because projects like Cedar, it's because projects like LNG Canada that you're going to see a different Indigenous Canadian economic engine. We already seen it now today, and it's super exciting. Like, I am excited for my kids going forward because these are opportunities we've only ever dreamed about.
And I think people don't understand the scale very much of what the change is. Crystal, when you were young growing up in Kitimat, the Indigenous community was quite poor. Right next to non-Indigenous community that was actually very, very wealthy. Kitimat was always been one of the most popular sort of so-called company towns when Alcan was running this as a company town. They're very, very popular. The non-Aboriginal people loved living there. And the Haisla might as well have been on the other side of the mountain in terms of economic activity. So it's kind of interesting to see. Just a really quick observation. Chris mentioned really quickly about overlaps. And so those not so familiar with British Columbia, the whole process of the government setting up sort of land claims negotiations and treaty processes with the Nisga'a and others resulted in the creation of a whole bunch of lines on maps with overlapping claims between different Indigenous folks. And Chris, I'm going to ask you about this because one of the things that always stood out for me, you've done a brilliant job of this. Ellis Ross, who was your predecessor as the chief counselor, was this as well. Always said that both of you have always said that you were more than happy to share opportunity and prosperity with your neighboring First Nations. So talk to me a little bit about that, because I think it seems to me that sometimes we think that one community is gathering all the money for themselves and turning their backs on everybody else, but that actually isn't what I see working out in the area at all.
No, we've had our experience with the Rio Tinto modernization project, which took place in about 2010, where we essentially seen workers being flown in from other parts of the world, and we had actually it was a mandate from one of our hereditary chiefs that was speaking to how our communities had worked together prior to contact and in helping one another. And when you take a look at the makeup of most Indigenous communities, we have a lot of intermarriages, which means family connections in other places. Myself personally, I have my biological father is from Gitgat, which is a Tsimshian community, just located down the channel from us. And when you take a look at and take that into consideration at a larger context of our entire communities, we felt it was necessary because we all share the same experiences. No Indigenous community is exactly the same, but we share common issues, whether we're managing poverty, dealing with suicides, lack of opportunities and lack of training opportunities in our communities. And we saw the opportunity with LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink. They have more than enough employment opportunities that I know that for a fact that our nation can fulfill every employment opportunity, and to be able to have to share that with other neighboring nations, to whether it be employment for individual members of other communities, or to share the contract opportunities with other nations. When you think about that, the wealth that's being generated, and to be able to have that opportunity being taken by another nation in our territory, we know that it's the right thing to do. When I go onto LNG Canada's site, I obviously get overwhelmed when it's our own joint venture partners gaining contracts and awards on site. But when you see other communities' logos and symbols, whether it be Gitgat, Kikatla, Lakwalams, it's Kitsless. I think about what they're able to do with that opportunity and what they're able to do with their membership.
Quite astonishing, actually. And Krista, you'll remember I was up in Kitimat a few years ago when you had a workshop, essentially a big conference on economic development related to Coastal GasLink and the NLNG project. And you invited Indigenous communities and businesses from all across Canada to come. And there were people from Ontario with lots of people from Alberta, from Saskatchewan, all these kind of stuff, coming in and looking at opportunities. And it was really interesting to see that the priority there was giving opportunities to Indigenous companies wherever possible, because you couldn't handle it all, which is just the sort of straightforward sort of challenge. Let's raise this to a different level and ask Chris this question. So Chris, put it really simply, should Indigenous people buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline? And if so, how should they do that?
Yeah, they should. I mean, they got to be able to leverage with industry, and industry's got to be able to put equity on the table. Both. I think that Indigenous people are in a position now where we could get access to capital, but as you probably saw, the federal loan program might exclude oil and gas, well, fossil fuels in general, which I think is a mistake, because when you take a look at all these pipelines in our country, the vast majority, if not all of them, generate revenues so people can retire. The Canada Pension Plan, the teachers retirement plan, the list goes on of so many of our energy development projects in Canada that feed the rest of the country's ability to live and pay the bills and retire. So yes, absolutely. I think Indigenous people need to be able to partner up with industry. You've seen it with Enbridge out in Alberta, a $1.5 billion equity stake. You're seeing TC Energy do that with along the nations. Now, there are some nations that prefer just to stick with the revenue sharing agreement, and there's nothing wrong with that. Some just don't want to take that risk, where the vast majority are saying, well, wait a second, we want to be able to take that risk. We do have the resources to do it. So we're going to make sure we leverage not just industry and the banks and other investors. We're going to leverage our own capital and make sure that our lands are protected and that we continue to generate sole source revenues. That's the goal. So when we are able to leverage the land, when we're able to leverage the asset and the throughput, which is the gas, and then leverage the banks and our other existing businesses, we're in a strong position to acquire more equity. Lakwalams and Metlakatla did that a few years ago with Ridley Terminal, now called Trigon. And I believe we own 8 to 10% now with the option of buying more equity. And that's the steel coal terminal. So it's happening everywhere. If you take a look what's happening in Alberta and around the country, more and more Indigenous communities are leveraging programs like the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, where they guarantee the financing so banks and industry could come up with the funds for Indigenous communities to invest in said project. And it's just, the list goes on, and it's going to continue to get better. I could only see it getting better where Indigenous communities continue to outright own many of these projects over the next 50 to 70 to 100 years. I mean, it's just going to transform who we are as people to Canada. And it's just going to make and solidify what we've been fighting for all along, is to be a part of Canada, not apart from Canada. And if we could generate sole source revenues and not having to put our hand out for the government to help us with block funding, we're in a way, way better position. And we now get to move away from the INAC and the system that has once kept us destitute.
I think that's a really, really important point. I don't think enough Canadians really appreciate that own source revenue sort of idea. But basically, Indigenous groups for a long time rely on federal government money. My joke is, Crystal, I'm not sure you agree with me, is that the second worst thing about relying on the government is actually having to apply for all the grants. And the worst thing is having to get a grant and then have to report on it and go through all the processes and all the restrictions and things of that sort. Own source revenue simply means the money comes directly to the nation. You can spend it on whatever you want. And that really clearly is a real ambition. Is that not correct, Crystal?
It is absolutely the ambition. For far too long, our people have been going without and being told what we could and couldn't do with certain revenues coming into our community and how they would be spent and utilized. And now, I mean, you think about, and as Chris is talking about a lot of these topics, I feel very overwhelmed, especially with honor in regards to where we're at today and what we've been able to accomplish. It's been I've been very fortunate to be able to be a part of all of this, and it's gotten to the point where our nation is seen to being having the ability to contribute back to social services, not just for our people, but for the region. And one example of that is our contribution to the Northern Health Authority of $500,000 that we donated to be able to help our local hospital deal with COVID during the shutdown. We were able to contribute to ensure that our membership were provided the means necessary during such a stressful point in all of our lives. We're able to contribute to a dementia care facility where we're seeing a rise in dementia in our membership, and it's simply because we cannot provide these programs and services on our own to our membership. We need to be able to partner with other outside entities, so we see the need in meeting our membership needs by partnering, thus contributing financially to have projects such as the dementia care facility be successful.
It's so interesting and so exciting. I mean, to be part of that process of meeting the needs of your community directly and quickly and whatever. Chris, just to jump back a bit further again, so far we're 3/4 of the way through our talk so far, and neither of you has mentioned the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Nobody's mentioned free, prior, and informed consent. Nobody's mentioned Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. You're talking about using different tools. So, Chris, where do those other sort of legal and aspirational documents fit into the sort of planning process for Indigenous people in the oil and gas sector?
Well, I mean, those are questions I get asked all the time, and I think it's not a one size fits all. It really depends on the nation itself and how they want to implement UNDRIP. For so long we've always gone on case law and free, prior, informed consent. I think it's safe to say that prior to the framework of UNDRIP, that the vast majority of us that have been engaged in big business have been doing about 80 to 90% of that. When it comes to engagement. And I think a lot of people misunderstand. I think, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but I think our people do misunderstand when we talk about free, prior, and informed consent and UNDRIP. It's not a veto. And if there was a veto, then we would get nothing built in Canada. Free, prior, and informed consent is that both parties, both industry and First Nation communities, need to be satisfied with the process. Now, we may not get 10 out of 10 things, but if we could get between 5 and 7 of those things and be satisfied and then work to the rest as we move forward for the next few decades, I think we'll be in a stronger position. But I think it's important that UNDRIP continue to move forward. I don't think we'll see it fully implemented for the next probably 15, 20 years. It's going to be a long journey. But that being said, when we take a look at our lands, when we look at our creeks, when we look at our forests and the food we use to sustain ourselves, we're not going anywhere. And neither is they. I mean, those creeks and rivers have been there for thousands of years. And I think Indigenous perseverance through against all odds, that will be patient enough to implement UNDRIP. But again, it's not a one answered question. A lot of people look as UNDRIP as sometimes somewhat of a hindrance, but others look at it as a path forward to make sure that we incorporate Indigenous law and protocol and making sure that we opportunity, but to be a part of the whole social health and safety of like the rest of Canadians. And I think that's what UNDRIP is going to bring us. And UNDRIP also, what I've noticed, has been able to make us, we're much, much more stronger when we feel enriched and proud of who we are as a people, to be proud of our culture and our language and arts. And so when we're strong in that sector, we're going to be strong in all other sectors. That includes business.
Well, and you're strong. I know you two well enough, but know the communities more generally, and there are a lot more strength there than people think. We had an interesting question here from Sabrina and Crystal. I know you were telling us just before we started today that you were actually invited to go to Dubai and participate in the COP28 sort of process. What would you have said if you were there? What would your speech have covered if you were at COP?
I think my speech would have covered the fact that I believe that our communities are part of solutions when it comes to the environment. Displacing other harmful forms of energy in our world is a benefit to all. When you think about the conversations of the NGOs and telling us we're not Aboriginal enough because we're not opposing these projects. I kind of bring it to the context and have had these conversations with other Indigenous leaders that tend to think of the like of those environmentalists, of protecting our territories. And I often have the conversation of our communities aren't protected by bubbles. If I could put our territory in a bubble and protect it from what's happening in this world, I would. But that's unrealistic. It's unattainable goals to have that. So we need to be part of solutions when we're thinking about the global context, and have that Aboriginal or Indigenous thought when we're thinking about the world, not just our territories. So in regards to what we're doing and what we're supporting, I truly believe that we've found a balance. We're helping the environment by supporting these projects, by displacing other levels of harmful energies, and doing it while we lift our community out, and other communities and other regions out of poverty.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and thank you very much, Crystal. That was just terrific. But I guess the other one, Ralph asked this question. So Chris, I'll turn this one to you. About, here you got oil and gas and you have pipelines, and the pipelines are going to produce annual revenue, and revenue is going to help, support the community. But Ralph's question was, do you see opportunities to take that wealth and to create new, more sustainable Indigenous enterprises? In other words, is this the end point for Indigenous economic development, or is it the starting point for Indigenous economic development? So Crystal, you're shaking your head so rapid. I'm going to go to you first, Crystal, then Chris.
Oh, sorry. My family calls me Chris, so I thought this one was coming to me. Sorry, Chris. I truly believe that this is the beginning. This is only the beginning for our communities, and I can't help have this excitement in regards to seeing where our communities take it to the next level. This is just the starting point, and it's absolutely exciting to see. I mean, Chris brought up seeing his kids when they're his age, and I've got 2 kids of my own, and I've got 2 grandsons, and I'm already seeing the transformation. I'm already seeing the entrepreneurial spirit in our community of the limitless opportunities that are not just our membership have, but our community has in regards to branching out. We see an opportunity here. We can start up a business where it's a landscaping company or a laundry facility. So I truly believe that this is absolutely just the beginning of what our communities and our nations can do.
Thanks, Crystal, so much. Chris, did you have something to add to that?
I do, absolutely. It has changed so much. This is just the beginning, and we all want to be able to develop our economies in a sustainable manner. The reality, in my opinion, and based on who I work with and what I'm watching around the world. It's not just here in Canada. People need to understand that Indigenous engagement is taking place all over the world. And oil and gas aren't going to go anywhere. We have the opportunity to develop hydrogen. We have the opportunity to develop nuclear. And just technology itself is advancing to unbelievable levels that I have never seen before, to a point where we are getting rid of the harmful emissions. We are getting rid of old ways of burning fuel like coal, brown coal, and brick and mortar. When I met with the Indian government during the Congress, the Petroleum Congress, they're just now moving to oil and gas, and they won't get to carbon neutral probably until, well, for the next 70 years, he was saying, but probably around 2070. But yes, do I believe in taking the money that we generate from these projects and invest in the green opportunities? 100% I do. I have never been against the ability to take the money that we make and pour it into other initiatives that could help bring prosperity to our people. That said, we also got to be realistic about where we invest that money. And, I've come out with some op-eds, the real tall tale about what it actually means to be green. Look, whether people like to hear this or not. Now, I'm not against electric vehicles, but every time electric vehicle is produced, oil demand goes up, not down. And just one of those batteries alone weighs about 8,000 pounds, and it only lasts about 8 years to the lifespan, to its lifespan. So let's just be manageable and smart about this. Let's manage our emissions responsibly. Let's be smart about trying to do the emissions reductions plan, because what we're seeing right now, when we talk about sustainable development, what we're seeing is this aggressive agenda by the government that it's not helping Canadians. It's actually hindering Canadians' ability to not be able to afford the light bill, not being able to afford the grocery bill, not being able to afford putting gas in the car. That's not what we're supposed to do as a country. We are supposed to be able to give people the ability to choose what they want to do with their lives and their families' lives, so they could we can't be making such a rush decision on this emissions cap, because I really strongly believe it's just going to push more and more Canadians into energy poverty. And if we can't afford basic energy needs, basic electricity, then what are we doing as a country? Again, I'm not against sustainable green projects, but if you could show me that there are technologies out there, when we talk solar and wind, that's going to take over our national grid or somehow contribute to our national grid in a sustainable manner and cost effective, I'm all for it. But until then, we can't be shutting off the taps to a resource that's bringing us prosperity. We're finally at the table. Don't take it away from us.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Imagine all that years of fighting to get a chance to take a leadership role, and then folks are trying to strip that possibility. That's really interesting. So, Crystal, last question. We're down to the last 5 minutes. So one last question, and then give you both a chance to wrap up. Anne asked this question, and I think is really central to the public understanding of what's going on. No community in Canada, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, is 100% in support of oil and gas development, pipeline development, or any kind of development. You'll always find people who are opposed. In the case of Indigenous communities, and Chris mentioned the Wet'suwet'en situation before, where you have a group of hereditary chiefs saying they're opposed, and becomes an international cause celeb and all sorts of conversation. At a community level, how do you deal with those differences of opinion? You must have people in Haisla who are saying, please no cedar. Please don't, you shouldn't have done LNG Canada, right? I mean, that's just the nature of public affairs and public leadership. So how do you reconcile those different points of view?
And it is, I'm very fortunate enough that I have not had a member come and tell us that we do not want cedar LNG. So I
really,
majority, and we've done our engagement sessions with our community. We actually took that one to a different approach, where we did engagement sessions we had one specifically for both our hereditary chiefs, our hereditary table, and we took it by section of our community. and the excitement, overwhelming excitement of what the opportunity would be for us after Cedar does announce their positive final investment decision was definitely overwhelming. Specifically, I bring up our hereditary chiefs because the alignment that we have with them in regards to what we want for our nation as a whole is very inspiring. You think that when we have our hereditary chiefs come in and do any type of ceremonial openings, that their level of support is in complete alignment with our elected support in regards to our community benefits. In regards to other projects as they're ongoing, so LNG Canada, Coastal GasLink are in the process of their startup. And we have that continued engagement piece where topics of certain can be certainly contentious. However, it's the having those open conversations where we're inclusive and have proponents. We have our team vetting the information coming back to our community, and that level of trust that we've developed of having those hard conversations over the years have definitely solidified where we're at today. So it's just a matter of having those in-depth conversations where we're completely transparent.
You're always so funny, Crystal, because those conversations are extremely difficult. They're very time consuming. They require the greatest patience on the planet. You have to be respectful of very different points of view. And I love the way you sort of describe this as it is an ongoing process, but it is so inclusive. And it's designed to sort of bring people along. And what you're actually seeing is a sign of Haisla resilience, of a community that's determined to flourish in the 21st century. And I love every minute of that. We've got time for 1 minute from each of you. So Chris, you're first. Any last comments you want to make about First Nations in the oil and gas sector and pipeline development generally?
Sorry, Ken, can you repeat that?
Just what your last comments, anything you want to finish up with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, we've been in business for the last 10,000 years. We were entrepreneurs long before the word was ever invented. And we need to be able to think globally, but act locally. And now's our time to rise up and give back to the people. At the end of the day, it's about people. It's about building communities. And that's what we're simply trying to do. We're not sellouts. We're not somebody who's trying to just put ourselves ahead of everybody. I think if Crystal wanted to do that, she would have left a long time ago and went into tennis. It's just the reality. The reality is that we're here for our people. And even though I'm back in the private sector, it's always and always will be about the community. And when we build strong partnerships, Haisla is a prime example of what could happen.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris, very much. Crystal, the last word on this part's to you.
Indigenous participation is a solution. Our communities are no longer barriers to successful economic development. I truly believe that we're a part of solutions. And again, we make the decisions in the best interest of our people with that intent of improving the quality of lives of our membership today and many, many future generations to come. So thank you for allowing me and asking me to be on this podcast. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, Ken.
It's wonderful, Crystal. Crystal and Chris, your comments and stuff were so important and so valuable. I appreciate your tenacity and your passion and your enthusiasm. I think this whole purpose today was to look at First Nations engagement in the oil and gas sector and pipelines. You did a magnificent job of explaining that. And I think the important thing for me taking away from all of these conversations we've had over the years is that Indigenous communities are looking 50 and 100 years out. You're talking about the survival and it's no longer the survival. It's the question of resilience and the developing prosperity and opportunity that goes way into the future. And quite frankly, we've learned that sort of a welfare dependency approach doesn't work. Isolation from the economy doesn't work. Full engagement on First Nation terms where they're setting the standards and setting the expectations actually does work. And by the way, folks, companies are coming in large numbers. to the Haisla First Nation. They're coming in large numbers to talk to the Chris Sankeys of the world, because they see in you the kind of leadership and passion that will actually not just make Canada better, but more importantly, to me at least, give First Nations a chance to sort of share in national prosperity for the first time in Canadian history. You guys were fantastic. Thank you, Crystal Smith, very much from the Haisla First Nation. Chris Sankey, thank you very much. I've seen your fellow with Macdonald-Laurier Institute. A wonderful, wonderful conversation. So long, and thank you. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for participating. You're going to get an email copy of this webinar, and please encourage you to share it around. We want the whole world to hear what Crystal and Chris had to say today. Thanks, everybody.